It is a great pleasure to be here and to be partnering with the African CSO's Biodiversity Alliance to bring you this webinar on avoiding past mistakes, contextualizing Target 3 implementation in the Global Biodiversity Framework for Africa's protected and conserved areas expansion. That's a mouthful, but I think the important concept here is that the civil sector organizations, the nonprofits, the NGOs around the world, as well as governments, private sector organizations, indigenous peoples around the world are continually learning how to best protect landscapes for the very long haul, so that we are able to bring what we enjoy today to our children's children and beyond. So with that, I congratulate Karagu Mwangi, who is our regional representative at the ILCN for Africa, in organizing quite a thoughtful seminar today, webinar. And I will turn over the program to Karagu.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from, and perhaps good night for some who might be joining us from far ends of East. Welcome, everybody. My name's, as Jim said, is Kiragu. Full name's Mike Anthony Kiragu Mwangi. I am part of the ILCN Steering Committee, supporting the work of the network, and in particular, taking a special role in helping to grow the network in Africa. I also am a founder and director of a small environmental consultancy company called Earth Positive Consulting that has ambitions related to land conservation, conservation finance, ecological services, as well as other programmatic areas of environmental services. I have the pleasure to host this sit down with a few distinguished members of the panel, as well as the audience from all over the world. I believe we had registration from 88 countries. Of course, not perhaps everybody has attended or is attending, but we have the opportunity to coordinate and collaborate on this webinar with the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance. I want to take a moment to just recognize the efforts of Yemi Katerere, who's currently the lead of ACBA, Olivia Tawara, who coordinates their communications work, as well as Jen Otieno, who's also part of that secretariat and engaging us on communications work. So thank you very much for helping to get this webinar on the show. Equally, I want to recognize the efforts of my colleagues at ILCN who have helped to put this together. We're here to try and unpack a suite of questions guided by a panel. We'll first hear from Hassan Maulid, who will introduce ACBA. Hassan is the chair of the Secretariat Working Group for ACBA, and he will reflect on the implementation of Target 3 and what the role of that membership would be or should be. We'll then hear from Jennifer Mohamed Katerere, who is an expert on a suite of matters related to environmental law, justice, and human rights. And then we'll hear from Michael Gabo. Hopefully Michael will join. I don't think he's yet to connect with us, but we're anticipating that he'll be here soon. Michael is the Executive Director of SAT Conservation of Nature Liberia, who would give us a reflection on how the implementation of Target 3 can be done in the Gola forest landscape. And finally, we'll hear from Michelle Masozera, who is currently the Director of Policy and Institutional Partnership for Wildlife Conservation Society, who will speak to how implementation of Target 3 can be done in the Virunga landscape in Africa. But before we delve any further, I would like to just quickly give a sense of background and context about our work in Africa, as well as addressing the topic in Africa. Robin, if you may, I would like to just project a suite of screens. Can I go ahead? A suite of
Yes,
slides?
you should be all set to share your slides.
All right, cool. Then I should bear with me. Okay. Oh. Okay. In a moment, there'll be a deck of slides that will show up on your screens at the minute. So, as Jim has mentioned, the LCN is about coordinating a community of practice that is hoping to leverage a suite of expertise from different parts of the continent and the world in relation to land conservation, in particular from the private and civic land conservation network. We have a particular emphasis on convening a community of sorts, both virtually and physically, disseminating virtual tools, as well as any case studies that are worthwhile in supporting the endeavors of such a network, and promoting partnership that would help with cross-learning, and of course, raising awareness of the role of land conservation. Particularly in Africa, the agenda is to grow this network of partners and experts, to foster multi-directional learning, and to build this particular community of practice in Africa. Now, as most of you know, Africa has about 8,600 or call it rounded to 8,700 recognized protected areas. This map was provided during the Africa Pax Congress in 2021, and it was a representation of by UNEP WCMC, which is a representation of across the continent, all countries declare protected areas. So the light shade of brown is countries all over the continent who have reported they have protected areas. But one layer more, the brown color is a representation of those countries who are reporting to have privately protected areas, starting to make that recognition of the conserved areas that are managed by stakeholders that are not part of the government estates, or rather national government estates. And the third layer, which is a turquoise blue, is a representation of those countries are now reporting that on top of protected areas and private protected areas, they are also now recognizing the value of the other effective conserved measures, areas that are also contributing to biodiversity. Now, in that context, it's a recognition that protected areas in Africa have been growing and may continue to grow, but the potential in meeting target 3, which we'll speak to during this webinar, is mainly going to happen with the engagement of communities and indigenous communities and stakeholders in those conserved areas. Now, just as a reminder, target 3 is part of the Global Biodiversity Framework that was signed off in December 2022, and with 5 goals and 23 targets. But specifically for target 3, we know that it speaks to enabling at least 30% of terrestrial, inland waters, and coastal and marine areas of biodiversity importance to be effectively conserved and managed. Interestingly, the question is, how do we make sure that we shape the narrative of delivery of this target in Africa, especially to achieve that in the conserved areas, and ensure that livelihoods are not impacted, that this is done in a gender-sensitive way, and considering right-based approaches when implementing target 3. We'd like to explore some of the new forms of national, legal, and regional policies that governments can use and enable this to happen in Africa systematically. We also hope to examine potential funding mechanisms that might be there to support this ambition in Africa. So that is a context for the conversation today. we have an expert panel who have vast experience in handling or dealing with these matters, and we will soon hear from them. I would like to end there with that slide of a deck of slides, and just come back and stop sharing. Okay. How do I do that? Robin, do you mind just stopping me sharing? Yes, thank you. Thank you. To that end, I would like to invite Mr. Hassan Maulid. And Hassan is a certified climate change expert who also has experiences in peace and security. He is a co-founder, or Hassan has a Master's of Arts in Environment and Development and Peace. He's a co-founder of the Somali Greenpeace Association, a civil society organization and non-profit organization founded in a part of the world that is tackling climate change, environmental problems, food security, and empowering the youth. This society is called the Somali Greenpeace Association, founded in 2019 as a result of climate change and environmental degradation awareness needed by the Somali people. Hassan is currently the chair of Secretariat Working Group at Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance. Hassan, welcome, and please do share with us how you envision ACPA's role in implementation of Target 3 in Africa. Welcome, Hassan.
Thank you, Kral, and thank the rest of the team. And I would like first to thank the whole team of IRCN for collaborating with African CSO Biodiversity Alliance in hosting this webinar, especially on Target 3, to avoid past mistakes. Next slide, please. ACPA, or African CSOs, was formed in February 2021. It's a Pan-African organization with over 100 member organizations from different parts of Africa. And among those 100 members, we currently have more than 40 members in place. Our main highlights or contributions as CSOs toward sustainable use of the continent's biodiversity. Currently, we support of rights, governance, policies, and the creation of spaces and systems that give voice to local communities. Small-scale farmers, indigenous people are key to sustainable use. It serves as a platform for exchanging knowledge, information, and as a marketplace for alliances members. That means it's a voice for local organizations. Our secretariat is being hosted by the African Wildlife Foundation. We have signed an MNU in that regard as one of our great partners. We work with other networks like the CBD Alliance. We work with the Chinese Civil Society Biodiversity Alliance. We also work with Community Leaders Network. We also work with International Land Conservation Network. As ongoing engagement, we have also been working with ABCG, who are also supporting to efforts to conduct as capacity needs assessment for our network members. Next slide, please. We have been engaged in one or more functions that include research. Those are mostly in regards to biodiversity and also the climate change, which directly affects biodiversity. We are engaged in training and also community development. Our members operate at national and multi-country levels and position to support local actors and government in biodiversity conservation. Next slide, please. Our vision is to is our biodiversity drives and underpin is equitably, socially, and economically resilient and lively based on the rights of people That means people to be centered to sustainable use their natural resources, and they don't become just visitors. We want people all the time to be centered. Our mission is to elevate, amplify, create spaces and systems for local voices, as I mentioned before, so that to participate and influence decision-making process in the conservation of Africa's biodiversity for mutual and equitable benefit of people and the environment. Our key area of focus of working is influencing policy frameworks. Our main focus has been also to try to influence the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which also is part of the Target 3, so that sustainable use is prioritized and that there are financial resources and capacity to implement agreed targets. We also do capacity strengthening. AGPA will undertake, is currently undertaking the needs of members assessment to identify capacity gaps, and based on the needs assessment, members will be supported to develop organizational development plans and also system building that allows to be trusted, accountable both to their local communities, government, and to their national donors. What we also do is mobilizing financial resources. The strategy which AGPA has adopted can be supported to mobilize financial resources from traditional and non-traditional sources. Next slide, please. Our major public publications and reports so far we have carried out. We have done 5 case studies on sustainable use, included inclusive green growth initiatives. We have also done Kilombero district of Western Tanzania on African in partnership with African Wildlife Foundations. We have also published locally managed marine areas in Kirwitu co-management area. We have also done catalyzing private sectors. We have also done Namibia CPNRM case study, especially NASCO in Namibia. We have also done wildlife community forest reserves, both on pastoralism and water rehabilitation. The policy briefs that we have came up with included Grade 8 policy brief, which was published during the APAC. We have done also human rights and sustainable use biodiversity, an approach for people-centered and nature-positive outcomes. Sustainable use at the heart of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Reports and publications also include shared as an ocean approach linked to biodiversity and people for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. AGPA position paper on post-2020 GBF was also being published. We have also done voluntary commitment is to post-2020 GBF. AGPA technical note during the CPD site and AU conference in Addis Ababa has also been the publications we made, a review of biodiversity funding in Africa. All these links will be shared with you, with one of my colleagues now who is here. Olivia will be shared on our WhatsApp group so that you can go and look. Next slide, please. The advocacy and campaign milestones which AGPA has undertaken include our nature and our health, that is zoonotic disease, securing future for great apes, wild migratory birds lead alongside BirdLife International. Our campaigns include Shared Earth, Shared Ocean, World Day for Indigenous People alongside care, indigenous use for People's Voices for Biodiversity alongside CBD Alliance. We are also separated international. We have separated International Women's Day, Environmental Day on major biodiversity days. We have also advocated and campaigned for From Paper to Action, which youth was the major backbone on this one, and we name it Youth Building Back Biodiversity Campaign. Next slide, please. Most of the dialogues that we have undertaken included nature-based economy webinar. We have also hosted with several post-2020 dialogue. Those people whom we have partnered included EU, the African Development Bank, the AGN, African Group of Negotiators, CSPAC. Next slide, please. ACPA key events, which also included on Target 3s. ACPA has participated on AMSEN currently, which took place the 19th AMSEN in Addis Ababa. ACPA was major engagement. It has contributed to key stakeholders draft engagement that was handed over to AMSEN president, included key message delivery on protection of biodiversity. ACPA has also participated and also hosted side events promoting Target 3 and also protection of biodiversity in alignment with the climate change impact. We had during the African Climate Week, our coordinator Yemi participated in the African climate change development, and he especially focused how finance is very important for conservation of biodiversity. We have also participated on CBD COP15, which we highly followed on Target 3, and which today will be discussed on this webinar. We have also participated on COP27 to majorly push on biodiversity issues so that it doesn't left alone and not only be focused on climate change issues. ACPA has highly participated on the first African Protected Areas Congress, which was held from July 18 to 23 in Rwanda. We have also participated on EAWG 14 from June 21 to 26. We have participated AU joint meeting of CBD and also CITES from May 19. ACPA has also participated on CBD on March. We have also participated on UNEA 5 on February 22. We have also participated on World Conservation Congress. Next slide, please. Our conclusion is ACPA aggregates African CSOs interventions and amplifies the African voices to influence, bring about system change, and to avoid past mistakes. We support capacity of members to access funding directly and also ensure that resources get to the local levels. ACPA also offers an exchange platform for other partners at national level, regional and global level, interested in successful post-2020 biodiversity implementation and also Target 3. We enable learning and cooperation among members, just the way that we are doing now with ILCN. And also we welcome our members who are interested to partner with ACPA. We see strategic partnerships at all levels. ACPA will continue to engage high-level decision-making bodies on biodiversity and related issues. Thank you. Over to you, Koralwa.
Thank you, Hassan. That's very, very detailed and quite an impressive body of work that ACPA coordinates for its members, and very, very active, despite the fact that it's a relatively new initiative. It definitely is punching above its weight. I think there's a recognition of the good effort. Olivia has shared on the chat where to find ACPA reports, and please click there if you want to access that. Hassan, we'll come back to you later when we come to the Q&A. Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more on how you envision the delivery of Target 3 by ACPA members, or indeed by through your own organization. Thank you. I would now like to extend a warm welcome to Jennifer. Jennifer Mohammed Katerere is a human rights lawyer, and Jennifer is an expert in human rights, environmental governance, and climate and environment justice. She has an extensive experience on developing and undertaking integrated research and defining interventions of human rights and conservation. This includes, for example, developing guidance with the IUCN and FAO on improving governance and strengthen human capabilities in pastoral lands in the context of implementing the voluntary guidelines for on land. Jennifer also recently developed a concept and approach for an IUCN publication on implementing human rights in protected and conserved areas. Jennifer currently provides an active and strategic support to an urban community living in degraded mining lands in their struggle for environmental justice and corporate and state accountability. Jennifer serves in the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, climate, specifically in the Climate for Development Program in an advisory capacity, and is an honorary member of the ICCA. She has worked and volunteered with IUCN in diverse roles, including on its governing and policy setting council, and in 2 expert commissions, one focused on social policy and other on environmental law. Her recent publications include mutually reinforcing transgression of justice in large-scale land acquisition in the public interest. Jennifer holds an NLB degree from the University of Zimbabwe, a master's degree from the University of London, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Witwatersrand. Jennifer, warm welcome. Thank you for being with us. And we would very much like to hear your thoughts on how you think African states can approach implementation of Target 3 while safeguarding human rights to avoid past mistakes of fortress conservation. Jennifer, thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Karago, and thanks to everybody else on the webinar. I want to really just try and provoke some thoughts about what human rights-based approaches may look like in the context of Target 3. I think we have to firstly recognize that we are in a very different place today in the struggle for community inclusion to where we were in the post-UNCID period in the 1990s. And in that period, co-management, community-based management, those kinds of approaches defined by the state and implemented with communities were in vogue. Today, we see a completely different approach to human rights through Indigenous people's struggles and the struggles of local communities. What has happened is that land and leadership have really become centered. These are the key concepts in the human rights struggles today. Next slide, please. So when we think about these struggles in the context of Target 3, it's important to remember that Target 3 is not just 30 by 30. Target 3 needs to be seen in the context of the bigger picture of the GBF, with its focus on equity and effectiveness, on land, on respecting and recognizing rights, but overall within the bigger goal of people living in harmony with nature by 2050. This really tells us that we cannot simply extend protected areas where they're going to have adverse impacts on people and that ultimate goal. Next slide, please. So many of us will know, of course, from Target 3 that these are the rights that are centered in Target 3 and in the GBF. Perhaps it's worth pulling out that sustainable use is not really recognized as a right. It's acknowledged, and there are important qualifiers there in the target where it's appropriate and where it's fully consistent with biodiversity targets. And perhaps the other thing to recognize is that consistent with international law, Indigenous peoples' territories are separated from the tenure rights of local communities. International law recognizes Indigenous peoples' territories, and they have a right to free, prior, and informed consent, whereas the rights of local communities on land tenure are embedded more within national law. Next slide, please. So if we're centering law in this debate, this discussion, it's perhaps important to think about who owns and who controls the land that protected areas lies on. I think in the literature you see between 50 to 60% of protected areas overlaps with the lands of Indigenous peoples and local communities. That means there's just 40% that is in the hands of the state or other private managers. And many of those, of course, also border on Indigenous peoples' lands. So who's to decide the future of these protected areas? I think what's clear is it can no longer be the state or conservation organizations that decide this. Indigenous peoples and local communities have to be part of that conversation about what future models should entail. It's worth noting that in the negotiations leading up to Target 3, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, IIFPB, put forward a third way or third category of land. And that was to recognize Indigenous peoples and local community lands as separate and distinct from protected areas and separate and distinct from OECMs. Why would they want to do this? They would want to do this because already we have a set of criteria and standards that have been developed by IUCN and endorsed widely about how OECMs should be managed. So for Indigenous peoples, having that third category is really important because it recognizes their leadership in lands that they control, rather than subjecting themselves to a set of predetermined processes. I think it's really important to remember then that for the 60% of land, we're really looking at Indigenous peoples and local community control and decision-making. And it's only in a very small percentage that we're then looking at state or private sector control. But we've also learned a harsh lesson since the Archie targets, and that is conservation is failing. Many conservations would not like it, but very recent research, Dawson's research, shows that 56% of their studies, 56% of the initiatives that they studied that were under the control of local communities or Indigenous peoples reported positive outcomes for people and conservation. This is compared to only 16% of externally managed conservation efforts. So this is a hard fact borne out by declining biodiversity, failing ecosystems, that only 16% of conservation is actually succeeding. The reality then is not that we need to include Indigenous peoples and local communities. The reality is that we need to look to them for their leadership, their knowledge, their practices in terms of how they are managing. At this point in time, the conservation community needs Indigenous peoples. We need to move away from the idea that we are somehow doing these people a favor. In fact, they are supporting us in our formal approaches to conservation. So if we really want to develop a different kind of relationship with Indigenous peoples, what should we be doing? And I want to suggest that we need to, based on what I've just said, have respect. We have to have a little bit of humility about science and our achievements. We need to develop systems of solidarity based on success factors that conservation science has established. So, for example, the research by Dawson shows that community management succeeds where there's recognition of local knowledge. It also succeeds where there's strong community institutions. So this needs to be a key focus of conservation interventions. And I was really happy to see that in Hassan's account of Akbar, that this is at the core of what they're doing. Conservation organizations can play a valuable role in providing learning, research, and advocacy, helping get funding to these local actors, and also in helping develop the capacity of both local communities and indigenous peoples to claim their human rights, and of the state sector to implement human rights. A third aspect, or a further aspect that external actors can look at, is how do we resolve the problems in existing protected and conserved areas that were appropriated. And I think we have to head on face the issues of restitution and reparations. By and large, the solutions that we've developed as conservation organizations, community-based management, co-management, and so on, haven't tackled this issue of land. We have bypassed it. Unfortunately, African governments have also bypassed it, including when the Africa Commission or the African Human Rights Court have actually ruled that these land rights must be recognized, either reparations must be made or compensation must be paid. So for me, land is the elephant in the room. It has to be addressed. It has to be addressed head on. Next slide, please. So critical step for us is how do we strengthen the voice of local communities, and how do we strengthen their ability to actually claim their rights. One thing that's really striking for me is how the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been centered and is centered in the debates in Africa. But we pay scant attention to the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas. Like UNDRIP, this is soft law. Like UNDRIP, it was passed by the United Nations General Assembly. This declaration had less support. It had about a 2/3 majority support in the General Assembly, which is still significant. And I think that it can be an important rallying point for conservation organizations in trying to strengthen local tenure. Importantly, it sets new standards for tenure security, including that peasants and other people working in rural areas have the right to participate in all decision-making processes that affect their lives, lands, and livelihoods. And I guess I just want to say, if we look back over the counting the years, over the last 15 years since 2007, how Indigenous peoples have slowly built the credibility of UNDRIP to the point where we now have UNDRIP being recognized specifically in the GBF, and specifically in how the CBD is moving forward. As Africans, we can begin to do this for local communities if we are able to center these issues of decision-making and land tenure processes. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the third, another way of strengthening the role and the ability of local communities and Indigenous peoples to be part of the discussion about future models of conservation in protected and conserved areas is to strengthen equitable governance. So early definitions of equitable governance focused on procedure, recognition, and distribution. And just to give you an example, when we talked about distribution, excuse me, sorry, I'm recovering from illness, but when we talked about distribution previously, we focused on the distribution of financial benefits coming from conservation projects. Today, it's recognized that distribution needs to also address the issues of access to other resources, capacities, opportunities, and importantly, the sharing of power. So the sharing of power would involve a level of accountability between conservation organizations, the state, and indigenous communities and local communities, and also new levels of transparency. When we think about the other aspects in terms of a human rights approach, when we think about procedure as part of equitable governance, we are thinking about procedural rights, the rights to equality and freedom from discrimination for women, but also freedom from discrimination, say, for example, of pastoral people. And if we look, for example, at the tenure of pastoral people, African governments have really not grappled with the issue of how to protect these common range lands and how to protect pastoral corridors. A lot more progress has been made around the tenure of settled populations of farmers, for example. So these are important things that we need to grapple with in environmental policy and how we think about protected areas as we move forward. How can we make this a reality? And again, I've put forward this idea of leadership of Indigenous peoples. We can no longer be talking about ourselves. We need real partnerships. We need tools and approaches to actually help us unpack these issues. And I highlight here, for example, a human rights impact assessment approach, which would, for example, in establishing new protected areas, ask that one thinks about how these rights of human rights would be impacted. One of the biggest fears of local communities is forced resettlement. And that would be an example of a right that would have to be addressed. The issue of access to benefits is another. Next slide, please. So really, I haven't quite done what Karago asked me to do, and that is to point to new models. But I really want to say is that we need a different way of doing conservation. We are not the experts. We have failed. And with that comes the humility to say, we need the help of Indigenous peoples, and we're walking into this conversation with respect, with recognition, with humility, and recognizing them as leaders in biodiversity conservation, as much as organizations like IUCN may be leaders in other aspects of knowledge, or ILCN will be an expert in land tenure models and so on. So we have to have a different way of having conversations. I hope that's useful, and I hope I haven't been too naughty in ducking the question. Thank you very much.
Jennifer, thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. And very, as you say, thought-provoking in the way of rejigging the thinking. I liked some of the key messages there, starting with land is central, and we have to approach things with a different styles compared to way before as it was done in the past. The idea of how do you address sustainability in land use, yet while it's acknowledged, it's not necessarily a given right. And thank you for pointing out the publication by Dawson. I think Florine in the chat was asking if you had access to the link for the report, but I think eventually he's found it. I think the publication is a 2021 publication, if I'm not wrong. But yeah, it's been shared on the chat function. Thank you for that. And I also like the point you make about shared spaces, not the same as OECMs, and we need to find ways of encouraging that to be part of the dialogue, to encourage that we have to take different styles of management on those landscapes vis-a-vis what has been used in protected areas. So lots of interesting points of view, and definitely the fundamental question, and I think we'll come to this later on, is how do we ensure some of those good practice are part of the actions that are delivered through the process of achieving this target. But we'll come to question and answer session where I'll pose some of those questions. Thank you, Jennifer. Fascinating. Before I move on to introduce the next speaker, I would encourage us to keep plugging the questions along the Q&A section. Thank you very much for those who are already doing so. We'll come back to this as we come back to the question and answer session, but please do plug your questions there. Thank you for those three who have pointed those questions. The next speaker is Michelle. We unfortunately don't seem to have Michael, who was going to speak about the experiences of implementing Target 3 in the Gola Forest of Transboundary Park in Liberia and Sierra Leone. But we have the fantastic opportunity to hear from Michelle Masozera. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. I'll just mention a little bit about Michelle. Dr. Michelle Masozera is the director of Policy and Institutional Partnerships for Africa at the Wildlife Conservation Society. He has over 25 years of experience working for conservation in Africa and is a specialist in wildlife conservation, community-based natural resources management, project management, protected area planning and management, and tourism. Dr. Masozera has a particular interest in inclusive conservation and capacity building of civil society organizations and young conservationists. He holds a Master of Science degree in Forest Resources and Conservation from the University of Florida, Gainesville, and a PhD in Natural Resources from the University of Vermont. He was awarded the National Geographic Buffett Award for Leadership in Africa Conservation in 2004, following the creation of Nyungwe National Park in Rwanda. He is a board member of several organizations, including Akagera Management Company, which is a joint venture between the Rwanda government, Rwanda Development Board, and Africa Parks for the management of Akagera National Park. Michelle, welcome. And we're very keen and interested to hear about your thoughts on what are the opportunities and challenges of implementing Target 3 within the Virunga landscape, which you have been working for a long time. Please take it on.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts on opportunities and challenges of implementing Target 3 in the greater Virunga landscape. So if I can go back a little bit about the Target 3, as it's stated in the Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 3 it's about ensuring and enabling that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial and inland water areas and of marine and coastal areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem function and services, are effectively conserved, managed through ecologically representative, well-connected, and equitably governed systems of protected areas, and other effective area-based conservation measures, recognizing indigenous and traditional territories where applicable, and integrated into wider landscapes, seascapes, and oceans, while ensuring that any sustainable use, where appropriate in such areas, is fully consistent with conservation outcomes, recognizing and respecting the rights of indigenous people and local communities, including over their traditional territories. So clearly, Target 3 involves a number of different elements and components, including concepts such as area of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, elements related to effective management, elements related to ecological representation, elements related to connectivity, equitable governance, and elements related to categories of protected areas, OSCMs, and indigenous and traditional territories where applicable. So all these elements are central, all these are central elements of biodiversity conservation strategies at local, national, and global levels. So it's a target that's very ambitious, and therefore it's essential for countries to understand the significance and the importance of this concept, the status, gaps, and the needs, as well as challenges and opportunities for its implementation from global to local level and at the landscape level. So here I'm going to talk about Greater Virunga landscapes and the opportunities and the challenges we have for implementing the Target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So Greater Virunga landscape, it's a landscape that is shared between three countries: the Democratic Republic of Congo on the western side, we have Rwanda, and then we have Uganda on the eastern side of the Greater Virunga landscape. So it's a landscape that has 8 protected areas, and it has a size of 12,000 square kilometers. It has a diverse habitat and contain more terrestrial vertebrate species and more endemic and threatened vertebrate species than any other sites in Africa. But at the same time, it's a human-dominated landscape where we have at least 2 million people. And it's a landscape with some of the highest world population density in Africa, or in the world, to say the least. And some areas around Volcanoes National Park in the south, you see a population of 1,000 people per square kilometer. So the main land use activities are agriculture, which is about 45%, conservation constitutes 52%, and artisanal fishing, which constitutes 3%. So as you can see on this map, it's a landscape that presents opportunities for achieving the 30 by 30 at this landscape level, mainly by creating connectivity between different fragmented forests. And this requires kind of new innovative way of thinking, incentivizing farmers, including farmers in this, because achieving this Target 3, we should all acknowledge that it's not a business of government only. It should not be a business of international conservation organizations. As we are speaking here, we are talking about avoiding the mistakes of the past. In the past, it has been a business of conservation organizations, international conservation organizations, supporting government to create national parks. It has been a business of international conservation organizations who assume they know what is good for people in terms of improving their livelihood without any consultation, without any kind of participatory approach to understand what are their needs and expectations in relation to protected area management and biodiversity conservation. It's a landscape where there are other opportunities. The three countries have created a governance mechanism where we have a kind of Greater Virunga landscape. I mean, Greater Virunga Transboundary Secretariat. It's a secretariat that's in charge of convening all the key stakeholders. And it's a secretariat that has been established by a treaty by the three countries, where they have the convening power. They can, they have the convening power of including all the key stakeholders, private sector, local communities, international conservation organizations. But again, as we are talking about avoiding the past mistakes, local community representation in this type of dialogue is very limited. So that's something based on just what Jennifer has talked about. I agree totally with her that that's the way we should be doing conservation. So given the governance framework we have around in the Greater Virunga landscape, opportunity to include everything Jennifer talked about to make sure rights and the benefits of communities are ensured. So to make sure people, I mean, we have a people-centered approach to conservation. But as I said, it's a landscape that presents major opportunities, but it's a landscape, it's a hotspot for major conflict in the Greater Reef region. It's a landscape where you have ADF around Rwenzori National Park mountains. It's a landscape where you have FDLR, which are former, the rebel group of Rwandan origin. It's a landscape where you have M23. So it's a landscape where it presents opportunities, but it's a landscape where there are so many challenges that prevents local communities to benefit from conservation. There are some best practices we can learn from, where, as I said, the Greater Virunga's Transboundary Secretariat has played a major role despite the conflict of convening all these different protected area managers, conservation organizations. Also, there are best practices related to revenue sharings coming from, generated from tourism. But as Jennifer said, that's not enough. We need to think more. We need to think, how do we become more inclusive so that people have rights, at the same time people have benefit from conservation. So, and again, coming back to people-centered approach, I'd like to say that the bottom line in all of this, it's about the governance. The governance system is the key to ensure this transboundary landscape are well protected, to make sure these transboundary landscapes are well connected through landscape restoration, and that cannot achieve without any minimum of governance. So Target 3, as I said, is very ambitious, but we need to be more realistic in what can be achieved and how it can be achieved, how can achieve the results. So the framework we have in the landscape is good, but we need to do more so that the three governments can start working together and to make sure we put in place all the frameworks for people to benefit and have rights to their natural resources. So briefly, that's what I can say about the opportunity we have, the opportunities we have, the Greater Virunga landscape. It's a landscape that is challenging, but it's a landscape also that presents many, many, many opportunities given the type of different habitat we have, given some of the best practices we have had over the past 20 years, 50 years, and given the possibility we have from international communities to support the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So thank you, Mike, for this opportunity. I'll be happy to answer any question related to this, what I said, and related to this Greater Virunga landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Michelle, sorry, and really appreciate those insights into the work in the Virungas. I'll come back and pick up on that, drill a little bit on how inclusivity is being achieved in the work that's been done in the Virungas. But you've highlighted a few key points there about the complexity of the landscape, population density, and the competition for use of natural resources by both wildlife and the populations there. And I think for me, the reason why I thought we could learn a few things from the transboundary work, both in Virungas and in Gola, is because the arrangements are complex. But in that complexity, the only reason they are still sustained is because there's a level or measure of success and you're learning as you're going. And there's some best practice that we can learn from that and adapt that to other parts of the continent. So I'll come back to you to understand a little bit more on how the inclusivity is being achieved. But I'd like to pose a few questions to each of the panel members before we open up to the audience. And thank you very much for those who are already populating the questions on the Q&A. Please keep coming. Keep the questions coming. So we've had a reflection of what possibilities are there with ACBA. We've had about what must be considered within the context of doing it right through the lens of human rights to achieve Target 3. And we've now had a bit more on how that is being done or can be done better within a particular landscape. Hassan, let me start with you and pose a question of what strategies are being developed or being implemented now, in particular in the landscape that your organization is working, Somali Greenpeace, to achieve the rights of nomadic and semi-nomadic people who depend heavily on the use of natural resources and to protect their way of life. How do we what is being done there? What can be done better that you would like to promote?
Thank you, Tiago, and thanks again for asking these important questions. Well, when it comes to protected area or protection, Somalia has a quite unique issues in terms for the past 30 years of not sustainable government of managing that protected areas. We can consider now we don't have clear protected areas in Somalia, and even we don't, as human, even are not protected. But again, in regards to your concern, what has been done in terms of conserving the environment? In Somalia, the major issues is about environmental degradation, about deforestations, which is again a source of livelihood to millions of people as a consumption of fuels. And also other key endangered species for use of livelihood, especially the gazelle that we call it the hare. So what has been done? While what we are doing now is about raising awareness issues in terms of how people can use that forest, the little forest that we have prepared sustainably, and how they can restore the degraded land. In terms of using sustainable, we are encouraging them to use, like if they want to use the forest as a source of charcoal and they can't afford to buy gas, we emphasize them to use the branch instead of cutting the roots. Again, we also support them to practice intercropping activities, growing crops at the same time, protecting the trees that they have. But in terms of Target 3 as ACPA, what our strategies have we developed? And we want to really to emphasize on this one. We cannot leave human being aside why we talk about protection or conservation, because this environment is dependent by human beings, and the environment also depends by the protection of human beings. So what are we emphasizing? To us as ACPA or as SOCBA at local level, our main issues now is to ensure that the implications of coming material global biodiversity is adequately addressed, and conservation efforts prioritize human uptake. What does this mean? We are advocating for access and benefit sharing, which will highlight the importance of incorporating fair and equitable access at all levels. And at the same time, to develop mechanisms for Africa's biodiversity, which has its unique challenges. The other thing that we currently doing is capacity building and also emphasizing technology transfer. As ACPA, we are stressing the need for adequate capacity building to enable so that African countries can fully participate in the conservation issues while protecting the human being. This includes ensuring that we have access to necessary knowledge, communities have resources, and also the technology to manage the agreed conserved area. We have also to consider we cannot talk about protection and conservation without talking about financial and resource mobilizations. So as SOCBA and as ACPA as a whole, we are emphasizing the need for increased financial support for conservation areas, because we are also need to think of how this how can we protect the human being at the same time protect the environment, since the biodiversity is being dependent by human being, by local communities who consume daily, and again sometimes in other countries conservation or protection issues will involve displacing of people from their original homes, which is harms people more than everything else. And again, we are also considering climate change. We cannot protect the biodiversity if we do not address the triple planet crisis which climate change includes. So these are now the current strategies that we are using so that we reach the target 3 by 2030, while emphasizing human beings are being prioritized first. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you. Jennifer, if I may, let me come to something you mentioned there about equity in both in delivery of protection of natural resources. I think you referred to a couple of things I think connected to me was the point around sustainability is acknowledged, but it's not necessarily a right by most society or for most societies involved in the conserved areas. And then you touched on the point on equity, which is not just about governance. It's also about, it's not just about financial resources. It's also about other elements of resource, of power and transparency. And I think, this is what is the ideal. However, how do we manage that within the context of in societies, especially in rural societies or nomadic, semi-pastoralist nomadic societies? There's a tendency for elite capture. And that then leaves the distribution of resources just to, or even power, just to a few. Perhaps drawing from your recent work on the report, the publication you did on mutually reinforcing transgression of just and mentioned in the introduction, are there any lessons that we can learn from that about avoiding this idea of elite capture in societies which are, again, people have legitimate reasons to say, I'm part of this community, but not necessarily that they represent the community adequately. Yet we know that it becomes a barrier for effectiveness of delivery of the rights. I don't know whether I've made myself clear there or I've just muddled that question, but please.
Maybe to start with the sustainable use thing. I mean, I think it's very problematic in Target 3 because it is kind of sort of, it's situated in the idea of lands of indigenous and local people being traditionally managed, and these peoples as being primordial, not changing, and that in itself, I think, indicates that we really don't understand the institutions on the ground. We really don't understand how knowledge is evolving. And I think the lesson really for conservationists, is conservation doesn't start up at the global level. Conservation starts very localized, and that is really where you can build relationships between the state and local institutions, where you can, and other stakeholders. So, if I look at this work that I've been thinking about, because we haven't done the work yet, in protected areas, and how to engage protected areas managers and to bring them into dialogue with local communities, for example, you can have processes of mapping and analyzing the problems on the ground between very localized conservation managers and community leaders or community activists, that can then lead to real solutions, whether that is at the most simple level, for example, of managing a water system. But when you want to make it very abstract, then we begin to I guess we generalize from the problems into making them such insurmountable barriers. And I actually think that many of these barriers are not insurmountable. One of the key things out of the FAO work that we did was really the need, where pastoral institutions were strongest is where they were most able to manage communal resources. And when you're thinking about pastoral communities, they are not just managing grasslands, but they're managing water, because the water is crucial to their livelihoods and their ability to move livestock. And I think it's really at that level that you can begin to see greater transparency. We also have to acknowledge that many managers at the local level understand culture. They come from those communities, or they come from similar communities, and are probably more able to break this barrier, or the hierarchical barrier. So I actually think if we think about conservation in that way, and we begin to, and this, I know this is partly what you are asking and are interested in, is if we begin to build these case studies of success, they can not necessarily be duplicated, but lessons can be taken from them. And for me, I think it's about how do we share those lessons at the right level? How do we begin to create community sharing of information that we have in the sort of conservation sector or in the academic sector? So that's one. I mean, and I have, I guess I did talk about the problems with sustainable use. I mean, I think this is also a problem with the relative weakness of African voices within some of the global processes. I mean, when are we going to stand up and say that local communities, some of them may be indigenous peoples, some of them may have traditional lifestyles, but not all of them. And many are dependent on agriculture, for example. And how do we create systems where biodiversity can prosper within those areas of sustainable use? I think, and this is where the relationship between the experts of conservation and the activists or the advocates is really important, is to be able to take that and actually see that goal get into policy documents. It's not recognized in the GBF in a way that is at least my view, is very concrete. Perhaps the benefit is that the processes of agreeing to terms and so on is still a process. You know, many things will still need to be defined. For example, the idea of a third category, a segue is created in Target 3 to it when it says, you know, it says systems of governance are protected and OECM measures, and then recognizing indigenous and traditional territories where applicable. So that creates a segue to the possibility, but it will depend on how well indigenous peoples can actually define that and give content to it within the CBD processes. So sorry, but long-winded, but yeah, we need to be addressing these things locally, I think, and then taking the lessons into the policy forum.
So thanks for that. And I think one of the things, if I quite got the gist of it, is maximizing on local structures of governance that are working and not trying to impose more. It should be more of taking advantage of what exists and what works, blend that with what might possibly add value to it, and then amplifying those examples into the different levels that would allow for us to learn from those, and vice versa in terms of cross-learning, transferring experiences and allowing for people to understand what else has worked, what has worked elsewhere, and also giving them the opportunity to feel that they have something to share. Thanks for that. I think that segues into what I wanted to ask Michelle about the inclusivity point in the Virungas. Now, one might assume it's a landscape that has sort of homogeneous ways of managing the natural resources in different countries, but possibly land tenure systems are different, possibly policies on natural resources management vary. And therefore, the question lies on how well is inclusivity of the local stakeholders in particular being addressed in the management systems that are being applied to ensure that there's consistency in how conservation is being applied in the Virungas. And hopefully, where would you say you are observing some of those elements of great case studies that we should all be hearing about, and we should be amplifying that in the different forums that we engage with?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah, obviously it's a landscape with it's not homogeneous. And the three countries have different policies and different governance systems and different land tenure systems. For instance, Rwanda has a land tenure system where every citizen has a land title. So, which is not the case for our neighboring country in DRC or in Uganda. But the commonality is what the three countries have learned from each other until the political instabilities, conflict have started, is tourism revenue sharing program. That's where communities, for instance, in Rwanda, is 10% of tourism revenue is invested in community development projects. In Uganda, I think it's 5%. But again, that doesn't prevent what we call elite capture, where you see the most influential people in the communities are the one benefiting from tourism revenue sharing schemes. But at the start, as a policy, that's a good thing about including people in conservation. The next step is how those revenues are shared. How are they distributed? The Batwa communities around Mugahinga, for instance, benefiting from that revenue sharing scheme. So that's another element where we have to go further, one step further to make sure These people who are custodian, who have been living this forest and who have been evicted from the national park created to make sure they're benefiting from the tourism revenues and other benefits that might come as a result of conservation of these landscapes. So away from being inclusive of tourism revenue sharing, it's a first step. But as I said, it's a human domain. I can't fathom how 10 million of US dollars per year can population density of 1,000 people per square kilometer. So we need to be innovative on other way of generating funding. Otherwise, it's kind of a drop in the ocean. So yeah, it's far from being homogeneous. It's complex because of political instability, community displacement. There's no way you can support people are moving. Some best practices from Rwanda, once other countries are stable, can be replicated quite easily. Because what is interesting is communities living in that landscape, they share kind of so same, I mean, the majority, they are what they call Rwandan-speaking people. So they share some commonalities in terms of culture, in terms of which means what we have done in one side of the landscape replicated quite easily because, yeah, I mean, traditions are the same. So it's quite easy to make sure people can work with people from DRC. And again, it goes back to what I said, from local to national level. There's no way you can have the ruminant approach to conservation without making sure that the governance is.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. If I may, I'll take a quick fire look into the Q&A that we've got. Thank you very much for those who posted the questions. I think some of them have been responded to by the panel. We'll just quickly look into this. I think in the question around biggest mistakes in conservation that we have committed, I think partly that's been responded by the fact that we are trying to avoid fortress conservation again as we approach the implementation of Target 3. What are views of what are our views on the big international NGOs implementing conservation projects in Africa? I think to an extent, Michelle has pointed out the fact that conservation can no longer be the business of government and international NGOs. It has to be inclusive of communities as well as others, not just NGOs at national level, but all the way into community-based organizations. But I think still there is a role there for international NGOs. To what extent that can be defined, I think time will evolve that, and hopefully dialogue should then help identify much more articulately better with each one's role. What are the opportunities and challenges to implement IPLC's territories as third-party category? Not sure whether that's been fully responded to, but clearly I invite any of the panel members to pick that up. What tools do you use to assess effective management of important landscapes? By Togasirai. Please, if you have any thoughts on any particular tools, in particular, I know IUCN documents quite a lot of that. And then there was one that was very specific to you, Michelle, which is about best practices. I think you've just responded to that about equity, sharing of revenues, tourism revenues. In Rwanda, it's 10%, in Uganda, it's 5%. but acknowledging this is not enough because of the great need of what is needed. I think earlier on, Jennifer alluded to the fact that equity is not just about financial resources, it's also about power and ensuring that there's inclusivity in decision making. And there's a question about examples of sustainable use of resources while safeguarding biodiversity that would qualify appropriate, fully consistent under target 3. Perhaps I would invite the panel to quickly respond to that. And the final one is about climate change is as a global environmental challenge. How are we prepared to address its impacts on the Greater Virunga as we implement target 3? Yeah, shall I bounce that back to you, Michelle, Jennifer, Hassan, if you have any quick thoughts on this?
So there were many questions. I don't know which one to start with or which one we should. But yeah, Mike, do you have any?
I think the one around climate change is global environment challenge. How we prepare to address the impacts of this in Greater Virunga landscape. Maybe that one, as you implement target 3.
Okay,
I suppose,
yeah.
Very briefly,
So
yeah.
I mean, it's good. Greater Virunga landscape. It's a landscape of high altitude, and it's clear that as the climate is changing, there'll be from lower level to upper level. So species will be moving upward. At the same time, because of the climate change, people still because they are dependent on agriculture, there'll be more encroachments on the protected areas. So one of the strategies to increase connectivity is fragmented forest so that we can increase area of movement for this. Secondly, it has been, it's clear Kanos National Park in Rwanda that during the dry season, there's scarcity of water and fresh water inside the park, and that increase conflict for bit of this spreading diseases between local communities and gorilla species because they are genetically close to gorillas, so we can spread diseases. So what the government and NGOs is to make sure there's a supply of water outside these protected areas so that water is available to address that scarcity. So third is about fire management. How do we make sure that during long dry season, there's no outbreak of fires? Governments and NGOs are working together as well to address those issues and in relation to that. And third is about disaster, because those mountains, we see flooding and landslides. So also thinking about settling people where there are risks of flooding and landslides. So those are key 3. One is landscape restoration to improve connectivity, but availing water in villages around this national park. And the third is about to prevent move people from area that are prone to risks or to disasters, moving them to other areas sustainably.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that very comprehensive response. I'm afraid we've run just slightly over time, and we won't have the time to address some of the other questions that might not have been touched on today. But I welcome your feedback, or at least continue dialogue with us. We will share this webinar recording, and I'm very, very pleased that we had, I think, about 47 people on the call today. I would like to thank you, my panel, this afternoon. And I hope that it started to shed a little bit of light into how we can move towards delivery of Target 3 in a lot more safe through safeguarding of human rights. I'm also aware this is an ongoing topic. Natural Justice are also planning something around this topic very soon. So watch out for any of some of the advertisement on that. But thank you very much to Jennifer, Hassan, Michelle for your time, and I really, really appreciate the fact that we had your expert thoughts on this topic, and we've got some good dialogue going. I want to also extend my thanks to the Akbar team and also the ILCN team who worked on the background to make this work. All the very best wishes, and I wish you all the very best as we keep having these dialogues on natural resources management and land conservation in Africa.